At 43, she was single, lonely, and deeply desperate for marriage and children. The kind of desperation that wakes you up at night and follows you through the day. She had wanted marriage and kids ever since she was younger, especially after having grown up without a family. She wanted companionship, a home that didn't echo, a child calling her mummy, and she had done everything she was taught to do. The silence in Sarah's kitchen was the kind that had a weight to it. She stood at the counter, the steam from her single cup of tea rising into the air. At 43, Sarah's life was a masterclass in discipline. Her home was spotless, her career was thriving, and her reputation in the church was legendary. But as she stared out the window at her neighbor's driveway, where a young father was struggling to buckle a toddler into a car seat, Sarah felt a sharp, familiar pang in her chest. She had wanted that. She had wanted the chaos, the noise, and the mummy called out from the bottom of the stairs. Growing up without a stable family of her own, Sarah had spent her 20s and 30s building a life she thought God would reward. Her closet was filled with elegant dresses, but as she picked out a deep navy silk for the morning service, she remembered why so many men had walked out of her life. There was the marketing executive who had laughed when she said she didn't drink. "A glass of wine isn't a sin, Sarah. You're living in a bubble." Then there were the dozens who had vanished the moment she made it clear that her bed was off limits until a wedding ring was involved. In the modern world, and even in the modern church, Sarah's purity culture was seen as an antique. To her co-workers, she was a Victorian relic. To the men she dated, she was a challenge that eventually became too much work. Even the Christian brother she had finally trusted, a man who led the men's ministry and quoted Paul with tears in his eyes, had eventually turned on her. "You're too rigid, Sarah," he had spat at her the night she found the messages from another woman on his phone. "You think you're so holy because you won't sleep with me? I'm a man with needs. If you won't meet them, someone else will. You're going to be a virgin until you're a ghost." That night, she hadn't just lost a boyfriend, she had lost a piece of her hope. She began to wonder, was I wrong? If I had just partied a little or compromised just once, would I be sitting across from a husband right now? She pulled her car into the parking lot of Grace Assembly, taking a deep breath to put on the pillar mask. As she walked toward the lobby, the whispers followed her like a cold draft. "There she is," a deaconess murmured, adjusting her hat. 43 and still unmarried. Such a waste. She's so focused on being Holt, she forgot to be desirable. Sarah kept her eyes forward. She sat in the third row, her usual spot. To her left, a young mother was breastfeeding under a shawl. In front of her, a husband was gently rubbing his wife's back during the opening prayer. Every worship song felt like a battle. She sang about God's overflowing blessings while her own cup felt bone dry. She listened to sermons about God's perfect timing while her biological clock felt like a bomb that had already gone off. When she got home that afternoon, the mask finally shattered. She didn't even take off her shoes before she collapsed onto the sofa. The tears weren't quiet. They were the raw, ugly sobs of a woman who felt she had been cheated by her own faithfulness. "Is this the reward for following your word?" she cried out to the empty ceiling. "Why is the devil allowed to mock me for my purity? Why do the worldly women have the families I fasted for?" Her prayers had shifted from, "Lord, send him," to, "Lord, why have you forgotten me?" She was on the edge of a deep, dark depression, her bed becoming a place she struggled to leave. When she saw the flyer for the Deep Waters Church Conference, she almost threw it away. She was tired of being the single sister in the crowd. She was tired of the pitying looks and the "don't worry, honey" cliches. but something, a tiny, desperate spark of what if, flickered in her spirit. "Maybe this is the one," she whispered. "One last time. I'll go one last time." She didn't know that her heart was now so hungry that she could no longer taste the poison. She didn't know that her desperation had stripped away her discernment. She was walking into a room full of people, looking for God, but a predator was already in the room, looking for a woman exactly like her.
The Deep Waters Conference felt different from the dozens Sarah had attended over the years. Usually, she left feeling more hollow than when she arrived, but this time, the air seemed to hum with possibility. It was there, near the altar during the final call for prayer, that she met Michael. He didn't just walk up to her, he seemed to materialize into her world with a grace that felt divinely orchestrated. He was everything she had listed on those prayer papers she'd burned or buried years ago. Tall, articulate, and carrying a quiet confidence that felt like a shelter. When he offered to pray with her, his words weren't generic. He prayed for the silent burdens and the treasures kept in secret. For the first time in a decade, Sarah felt like someone was looking past the pillar of the church and seeing the woman underneath. They didn't rush. Michael was a master of the slow build. Their dating started with long conversations over coffee that lasted until the baristas were stacking chairs. They talked about theology, their shared desire for a family, and the trials of the wait. Michael seemed to honor her boundaries, never pushing, always asking for her thoughts. He became the person she texted first in the morning and the voice that lulled her to sleep at night. For 2 months, Sarah lived in a state of suspended disbelief. She found herself smiling at her reflection, the lines of worry around her eyes softening. She felt like she was finally being rewarded for those 20 years of no. But as the 3rd month began, the spiritual veneer started to show its first thin cracks. It began with Michael's hands lingering a little too long on her waist after a prayer. It escalated to intense, heavy sessions of kissing that left Sarah breathless and terrified. The man who had once prayed with her for hours was now the man who sighed with frustration every time she gently moved his hand away from her hem of her dress. "Sarah, we aren't teenagers," Michael whispered one rainy Friday evening in the dim light of her living room. The house, which usually felt so empty, now felt claustrophobically small. "I'm 37. You're 43. We know where this is going. We're practically married in the eyes of the Lord already. Why are you putting a wall between us?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I've waited my whole life for the covenant, Michael. I want to honor God." "Is it honoring God to be so rigid that you're cold?" Michael's voice was sharp, a side of him she hadn't seen. He stood up, pacing the floor. "I've been patient. I've respected your rules. But I'm a man, Sarah. I need to know that the woman I'm going to spend my life with actually wants me. If you're this guarded now, what happens after the wedding? Or is there even going to be a wedding? Because I can't build a life with a statue." The word statue hit her like a physical blow. It was the same word the church gossips used. It was the same insult the office girls threw at her. The fear of Michael walking that door, of returning to the deafening silence of a house set for one, became a physical weight in her lungs. She looked at his frustrated silhouette and saw her last chance fading away. She thought of the babies she still wanted to carry, the husband she wanted to cook for, and the mummy she so desperately wanted to hear. Desperation is a powerful hallucinogen. It makes poison look like medicine. Sarah looked at the years of purity she had guarded so fiercely, and in that moment, they didn't feel like a treasure. They felt like a burden. They felt like the reason she was still alone. When Michael reached for her again, she didn't move his hand. She didn't quote scripture. She simply let out a long, shuddering breath and surrendered. She chose the touch of a man over the peace of God, telling herself that the miracle of their meeting justified the compromise of her conviction. The act was clumsy and filled with a strange, immediate sense of grief. As Sarah lay there afterward, the ceiling fan spinning slowly above them, the glow she expected never came. Instead, a cold, heavy darkness began to settle in the pit of her stomach. She turned to Michael, expecting a whisper of love or a promise of the future, but he was already reaching for his phone. The change was instantaneous. The warmth that had defined Michael for months vanished, replaced by a clinical, distant politeness. He didn't stay the night. He didn't pray with her. He simply kissed her forehead with a dry, distracted air and told her he'd call her tomorrow. But tomorrow came and the phone was silent. 2 days passed, then 3. When he finally did reply to her texts, their messages were short, one-word answers that felt like slammed doors. The man who had seen her heart at the conference was gone. By the end of the week, Sarah sat on her bed, the same spot where she once prayed for him, and realized the cruel irony. Michael hadn't wanted a wife. He had wanted to see if he could break the unbreakable Sarah. He had hunted her purity like a trophy, and now that he had it, he had no use for the woman who carried it. The silence of a phone can be louder than a scream. For Sarah, the days following that rainy Friday were a slow descent into a cold, clinical reality. Michael's texts, once overflowing with morning blessings and scripture of the day, had dried up into one-word acknowledgments. Then they stopped altogether. By the second week, his phone went straight to voicemail, a digital wall that told her everything she didn't want to hear. She was no longer a person to him. She was a completed task. The betrayal was a jagged glass in her soul, but it was the physical shift that truly terrified her. It started as a faint, metallic taste in her mouth and a heaviness in her breasts that she tried to attribute to stress. But by the third week, the nausea arrived. It wasn't the kind of stomach flu she was used to. It was a deep, rhythmic rolling in her gut that peaked every morning at 6 a.m., right when she should have been getting ready for her morning devotions. She stood in the pharmacy aisle of a grocery store 3 towns over, terrified that she would run into someone from Grace Assembly. She felt like a criminal, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tucked a small rectangular box under a bag of frozen peas. When she got home, she left the box on the bathroom counter for 3 hours, staring at it as if it were a bomb. The 2 pink lines didn't just appear, they glowed with a finality that made the air leave her lungs. Sarah sat on the cold tile floor, her back against the bathtub, and stared at the evidence of her ruin. At 43, the miracle she had fasted for had finally arrived, but it had come through the back door of her greatest failure. The internal monologue was a war zone. One voice, cold and panicked, whispered of the sensible solution. It spoke of her reputation, the pillar status she had spent decades building, and the look on Deaconess Miller's face when the news broke. It spoke of a quiet clinic, a Saturday morning appointment, and a secret that could be buried forever. Nobody has to know, the voice urged. You can save your ministry. You can save your name. God will forgive you for protecting the work He's doing through you. But as Sarah looked at her reflection in the mirror, she realized with a sickening clarity that she was considering a second sin to cover the first. She was considering discarding a life to save a lifestyle. The shame was a suffocating shroud, but beneath it, a tiny, stubborn spark of conviction began to glow. She thought of the worldly women she had judged, the ones she had looked down upon for their messy lives. She realized she was no better than them. She was just better at hiding. If she took the easy way out, she would be a hypocrite for the rest of her life, a standard built on a foundation of blood and lies. "No," she whispered to the empty bathroom, her voice shaking but certain. "I won't kill my child to save my face." The decision brought a strange, terrifying peace. She knew what was coming. She knew the whispers in the foyer would turn into shouts. She knew the Christian brother who had caused this was long gone, and she would have to carry this cross alone. She was about to become the very thing the church gossips feared, an unwed mother in the sanctuary. As she lay in bed that night, her hand resting tentatively over her still flat stomach, Sarah felt the first stirrings of a new kind of faith. It wasn't the perfect faith of the woman who followed all the rules. It was the desperate, clinging faith of a woman who had nothing left but the mercy of God. She didn't know how she would survive the stigma, but she knew she would no longer be a statue. She was a mother now, and for the first time in 43 years, the house wasn't just empty, it was waiting. The walk from the church parking lot to Pastor Samuel's office felt longer than the 20 years Sarah had spent serving at Grace Assembly. Every step was heavy, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt as though the word sinner was branded across her forehead in neon lights. She reached the door, her hand trembling so violently she had to grip her purse to steady herself. She wasn't just losing her reputation today, she was handing over the only identity she had ever known. When she sat across from Pastor Samuel, the silence in the room was suffocating. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, the man who had been like a father to her since she moved to the city. "Pastor," she began, her voice cracking, I have failed. I have broken the very thing I spent 43 years guarding." The words tumbled out through a flood of hot, bitter tears. She told her everything, the crushing loneliness that had become a physical pain, the deception of Michael, the moment of weakness, and the 2 lines on the test that had changed her world. She waited for the gavel to fall. She expected a lecture on the standard, a temporary suspension from ministry, or the cold, disappointed gaze she had seen on so many holy faces. Instead, she heard the soft creak of a chair. Pastor Samuel didn't stay behind his desk. He walked around, knelt beside her chair, and handed her a box of tissues. "Sarah," said Pastor Samuel softly, his voice thick with a kindness that felt like a healing balm. "For 20 years, you've tried to be a pillar for this church. You've carried the weight of being perfect so everyone else could have an example to look at. But God doesn't want a statue, Sarah. He wants a daughter. You aren't a scandal in this house. You're a woman who needed mercy, and thank God we serve a Father who has plenty of it." The news didn't stay in that office, but it didn't travel the way Sarah had feared. Pastor Samuel and his wife, Sister Martha, stood in the gap for her. When the whispers began in the foyer, the sharp tongues of those who wanted to cast stones, they were met with a firm, protective grace. The turning point came 6 months later. Sarah was sitting in her living room, her belly now a prominent, beautiful curve under her dress, when her doorbell rang. She opened it to find 5 of the aunties from the church, the very women she had feared would judge her most. They weren't carrying stones, they were carrying boxes of diapers, a hand-knitted blanket, and a rocking chair. "We realized," Sister Miller said, her eyes unusually soft as she stepped inside, "that we were so busy watching you to see if you trip that we forgot to love you while you were standing. This baby isn't a mistake, Sarah. She's a member of this family." The night Sarah went into labor, she wasn't alone. Sister Martha was there, holding her hand through each contraction, whispering prayers when Sarah's strength began to fail. At 3:14 a.m., the silence that defined Sarah's house for a decade was finally permanently broken. The nurse handed her a small, warm bundle wrapped in a pink hospital blanket. Sarah looked down into a face that was a perfect miniature miracle, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a head of dark, soft hair. As the baby let out a sharp, healthy cry, Sarah felt the last of the shame evaporate. She named her Eliana, meaning God has answered. A month later, Sarah walked back into Grace Assembly. She wasn't the pillar anymore, she was a mother, carrying a car seat and a diaper gag, her pace a little slower and her heart a lot fuller. As she took her seat in the 3rd row, she didn't look for the judgmental eyes. She didn't feel the need to hide. When the worship music began, she didn't sing from a place of perfection, she sang from a place of deliverance. She realized then that her waiting years hadn't been wasted, but her falling hadn't been the end. Michael meant to break her, but God was using the broken pieces to build something she never could have fashioned on her own. She looked at the empty space beside her on the pew and smiled. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the evidence of a God who specializes in beautiful endings. Sarah walked home that afternoon, the sun hitting the sidewalk as she pushed the stroller. The house wasn't a museum of what could have been. It was a home, filled with the scent of baby powder and the messy, glorious noise of a life being lived. She was 44, an unwed mother, and a survivor of her own desperation. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't just a standard to others. She was Sarah, forgiven, loved, and finally, truly home.